Thanks, everyone. My name is Bill Coleman here on behalf of Blandon Foundation, and this is the third of 7 webinar series that we're doing around intelligent community. And again, today we have Robert Bell with us from the Intelligent Community Forum, and today the topic is connectivity. And many communities come to the Intelligent Community Forum, I believe, through this connectivity lens. I know that people start to chase better broadband. And then as you think about how, what's the purpose of this broadband, the Intelligent Community Framework really helps support the argument that we need high quality broadband everywhere in our community, county, or region to really survive. It's interesting, Robert, you talked about the conference going on now, the Intelligent Community Conference from Western Canada, and I saw the theme is something about thriving, not just surviving.
Yeah, from surviving to thriving, yeah.
And that's those words are in our Minnesota broadband vision that we adopted 3 or 4 years ago, Bernadine. So it's fun to see that.
2015.
Wow. So there we go. Now I am feeling older all the time because that seems recent. So, but great. So in any case, we want our region, and here in Northeast Minnesota, a lot of our efforts between Blandon and IRRR definitely started around the idea of connectivity and how can we improve the broadband services in the region, tied again to the Intelligent Community Framework. So without further ado, Robert Bell, welcome.
Well, thank you once again, everybody. Pleased to see you. I'm gradually getting to know some of you and enjoying the experience very much. Yeah, connectivity, right? I mean, it's essential and yet it's not everywhere. That's basically what we're dealing with. And today I'm going to be talking about what the different things that different communities do to try to change that dynamic, because it's really hard to do if you don't have what it is you need. So let's do this now and hit the little share button. That's right. Come on. There we go. Can we see the screen? See the slide? Yes. Somebody thumb? Yeah, good. Thanks, Phil. Okay. It's the foundation for everything you do here in this world of connectivity. Last time, if you were with us, we talked about engagement as being engagement of citizens, businesses, institutions of all kinds as being the foundation or the power behind, if you will, the power behind this movement for change. When we're talking about connectivity, we're talking about now we've kind of dug the hole and now we're going to actually build the foundation for it. Once again, we're referring to what we call the ICF method, which consists of these 6 factors of connection, knowledge work, innovation, engagement, inclusion, and sustainability. We're going to be focusing specifically on connectivity. Now, there are 3 laws of broadband connectivity that, you'll forgive me, are going to sound extremely simple-minded, and yet they're very powerful. They are: more coverage is better than less coverage. More capacity and speed are better than less of those 2 things, and lower prices for it all are better. Now, that's sort of obvious, but the reason I put them up on the screen is this: no matter where you are on this journey, your community will always need more. If you have 25 down and 2 up in 50% of your community, that's 25 megabits down to 2 megabits up in 50% of your community, well, you got a row to hoe, you got to fill in the rest of it, but you're also going to pretty soon need a 75 or 100 or on, because users are always finding new things to do with this stuff. And the one law we know about with communications is when I have some of it, I want more. I find a way to need more. So the takeaway there is that wherever you are in this journey, you need a broadband strategy because it's going to need to keep changing. A few other just, sort of touch points for us that we'll all hopefully can all agree on. Broadband's critical infrastructure. Well, COVID took care of proving that case beyond the shadow of a doubt. Broadband is also, for the most part, a private sector business, which, for many of us begins to seem increasingly odd when it is clearly a utility, just like electricity and water are, that we don't necessarily consider pure private sector businesses. But for now, is pretty much a private sector business. And given that, attractive markets, economically attractive markets, get good service from more competitors, right? I mean, that's obvious enough. And of course, broadband is also about geography. And if you're struggling to bring it to an area where people live far apart, or that's got a lot of mountains and hills and lakes, and this is Minnesota, so you have a lot of lakes, that's a never-ending issue for you. So net, when you start approaching this problem, figuring out that you need to change it, what you really need to think about is, how do I make my market more attractive to private sector businesses facing those geographic barriers and those profit barriers? Not that you're necessarily going to end up with a private sector carrier, but that's the way to think about it, because if you build your own network, you're going to face exactly the same issues that the private sector carrier does. So how do you make this market attractive? And of course, if you can make it attractive enough, then somebody else spends their money on bringing you broadband. And that's ultimately what you'd like to have happen. What you're trying to do is de-risk the whole investment. You're trying to figure out ways where you can make a better business proposition for somebody else, or if necessary, for yourself, to bring about the connectivity that you want and need. So we've been looking at a lot of communities doing this over a lot of time, and what we think is there's basically 5 fundamental strategies that communities choose amongst to change their broadband situation. And they are in order here from the absolutely least controversial, the one that the most traditional government, traditional community would have no problems with, all the way up to things that are extremely controversial and in which can sometimes get you up, end you up in court if you're willing to encompass that. So, and in each one of these things, there's, or I shouldn't say each one of them, 4 out of the 5, you've got partnerships. You've got telecom carriers in the mix. You've got property owners, integrators, a lot of people who can help you or also stand in your way. And they're the ones you work the problem with. So let's look at land use policy. Pretty much everywhere, it is accepted that local government can make rules that are going to affect broadband markets, just as they make rules for so many other things. So what do communities do when they want to try to change their situation? Well, some of them map existing networks to identify gaps. That's can be really, really powerful when those moments arise where the private sector needs something from government. It needs rights of way, it needs passage, it needs access to poles or conduits or whatever it might be. Those are the moments in which you can say, well, we have a problem here. We've got this zone that you're not covering at all, and we'd like you to do something about it as part of this process. And I know some of the communities in the Arrowhead have done exactly this. In some places, and I think this is less true than it used to be, but in some places you still have a conflict between 2 good goals for a local government or a county. One is, of course, to encourage the spread of broadband and cost-effective broadband as widely as possible. The other one is to earn revenue from the access to conduit or poles that you own. And in some places, those 2 policies are in conflict. We want more coverage, and you talk to the private sector, and what they're going to complain about first is the fees they're paying. So somewhere in there is a matter of striking a balance, and it's always a good idea to look and see if you are creating unnecessary impediments, and then figure out what to do about them. I think something that's been done all over the place, and this of course tends to work in locations where you're in the center of town as opposed to the outskirts of town or far out where people are few and far between. Whenever you're going to dig up a street, put in conduit. You do that for 5 years if you're willing to wait that long, and you end up with a network, and that network has value. You can run fiber through it very cost effectively and save the private sector a lot of money. And then this is an interesting one. You can change building codes. You can change building codes to require that new builds and renovated facilities get wired for broadband. It sounds kind of odd, but it's really can be very effective. And to illustrate that, I want to tell you the story about a little place called Loma, California. This is a suburb of about 25,000 people. It's 100 miles north, I think, of Los Angeles. It's got sun, it's got mountains. And it's a very attractive community for retirees. So it has a pretty traditional approach to things. But way back in 2005, which is 16 years ago, They did one of those community visioning projects and came up with the idea that they were going to be a connected community. And they set 10 gigabits as their standard, which doesn't sound crazy now, but in 2005, nobody could imagine what you were going to do with a gigabit of connectivity. And we're still not entirely sure, by the way, for most of us. And so they created something called the Loma Linda standard that required new builds and any renovation that would take up more than 50% of the facility or property to install broadband cabling inside. And I'm talking about cabling, to plugs in your wall and into a wiring closet and out to what the telephone companies call the demarcation point, which is where they can pick up the other end of that circuit. And okay, so, how much difference is that going to make? Well, in this particular place, they were able to take advantage of something, which is that it was a popular place to move to back when people were moving into California instead of moving out of California. And in 3 years, they had 12 projects pick up this standard and apply it. And some of these were, hundreds of homes, and there was mixed commercial and residential areas. So you've got that much connectivity in building really changes the dynamic for the telco that's going to hook up to it. So much of their work has been done. And it's so, again, without doing anything very drastic, you've changed the dynamic of broadband demand in that community. And when there's demand, the private sector is pretty good at coming out to meet it. Okay, strategy number 2, a little bit more aggressive, but not that much. Basically, it's the idea that we can build and operate a network to serve our own facilities. I mean, that's generally speaking legal throughout the United States and in most other jurisdictions. And so, big deal. You decide to do this. The only thing that's weird about it is the government's investing in telecom, which is not the first investment that most residents probably think you're doing, but it's a good deal. Typically speaking, you're making a capital investment to replace an operating expense. And the payback is, 3 to 5 years, which is terrific for that particularly for anything the government's investing in, which is usually longer term than that. And so you get this great benefit. And then so first of all, government, and I'm talking about the offices, the fire department, the police, the social services, and on, schools, gets much, much better service ultimately for much, much less money. But also it gives you a backbone on which you can launch things that are going to benefit the public. So you can install free public Wi-Fi using that network as backbone for it. And because the government now is going to be much more digital, it has the capacity to be much more digital, generally speaking, that's going to encourage the development of more online services that, of course, have to go out into the public internet to be used. But nonetheless, again, you're changing a dynamic there. And probably most interesting to me about this, and we've seen it in a few places, it begins to change how stubborn incumbents view the proposition, right? When carriers are saying, well, we're not going to invest in this place because we can't make any money doing it, and it'll just be lost. And then all of a sudden there's an entity building a pretty substantial fiber network right in their service area, and they're no longer getting paid to carry service. You can bet it gets their attention. And it makes a difference, again, the next time you have those conversations about, we really need you to extend your network to serve our community. So that's the government network. And a nice example of this comes to us from a place called York, which is it's a regional municipality of 11 counties and municipalities. And it's basically a shared service organization. So they have amassed all their purchasing power and using it to police, fire, health, and various other services. Snow removal is all contracted through this, and it's a good deal. Everybody saves money and gets better service. Well, back in 2002, they had a bunch of buildings around this very large area, and they decided to install a 1 kilometer fiber connect between a couple of buildings, and tested it. And the numbers worked out beautifully. They got payback very, very fast. And between these buildings, they had much, much higher levels of service. And so over the years since 2002, that drove the development of a 200 kilometer network, which is connecting city buildings, universities, schools, hospitals, the private carriers who, of course, want to provide the outbound service and the inbound service onto that network for government, as well as data centers, because they want the ability to provide government services. So you suddenly have got a very interesting network here, quite a powerful one, even though it's closed. it's open in ways that are very meaningful. And it ultimately led to the creation of a public corporation that did something that I really encourage, which is to think about how your fiber can be an asset that you leverage. So they came up with deals with incumbent carriers that were serving some of their rural areas and said, listen, we will swap with you some fibers on our network, which will reduce your costs for the things you want to do. In exchange, we want you to roll out service into these particular neighborhoods and areas within these underserved communities. And they were able to pull it off. They changed the business equation for investment for those carriers, and were able to get something that they needed by swapping something that they built and that had far more capacity than they're going to need anytime in the next 10 or 15 years. So really smart use of an asset that they built that they also used to save a great deal of money for not only the municipality government, but also all the counties and cities that are part of it. Okay, so that's government network. Again, should be very non-controversial. The business case is easy to make. Things get a little bit more interesting when we move into public infrastructure. Well, now it is the business of counties and municipalities to build infrastructure and to manage it, whether it's roads or lighting or whatever it may be. So this is accepted. This time, however, we're going to talk about infrastructure that's telecommunications. So in this case, cities or counties will build a dark fiber network. And what that means is they'll install the fiber optics or whatever the means might be of communicating. They will, run it between the various access points. And then they will turn around and offer it for lease to, and they'll of course have to power it and so forth and do all those, and do that other infrastructure. But basically, they're going to then lease it to telecom carriers and to businesses with big telecom needs in a business model that says the payments that they receive for leasing will cover the repayment of the capital cost, maintenance, and upgrade of the network. And so they've got this infrastructure. They're not, they're doing something very interesting when they do this. They're reducing cost and risk to stimulate competition without ever competing with the private sector. And that's an interesting trick, right? And it when done right, it really has been enormously powerful. So let's look at one example. This is Dublin, Ohio, which is a city of about 40,000. It's on the outskirts of the Columbus metropolitan region. Columbus is the capital of the state of Ohio. And so they're a nice suburb. They've been like a historic downtown, and they've got a couple of, because of the lifestyle they offer, they've got a couple of Fortune 500 headquarters there. Because you can always know that if the boss wants to live in Dublin, strangely enough, that ends up where the company locates its headquarters. It's one of those odd coincidences that spring up. But Dublin also faced the problem of being in the shadow of that much bigger city. I've heard big cities described as the black hole that sucks up all the heat and light in the universe. So Dublin may be a perfectly nice market to invest in, but next to Columbus, very little interest to the carriers. And so they decided they wanted to change that. And in this case, I'm not, of course, not talking about just a relatively low bandwidth home connection. I'm talking about business. Their business community really needed broadband, and they weren't getting it. And so Dublin ended up doing a partnership with a private company that built out this dark fiber network. They named it Doublelink, connected all the city facilities just to get that initial, and lit them up for the city facilities, and got that initial payback on it, but then began expanding it into the region and farther out through partnerships. And these folks really got this capacity sharing deal making thing. They would go very proactively to other cities, to research networks, data centers, and state agencies, and say, we want to trade some of the capacity on our network to you in exchange for your hooking us up to yours. And over again, they got these deals. And over time, this relatively small city in this Columbus area became a real regional communications hub, because the more carriers connecting there, the more carriers want to connect there. And they began connecting with telecom hotels and the Ohio State Supercomputing Center, and on and on and on, spurring the economic development of Dublin in a very, very big way. Okay, that's 3 out of 4, 3 out of 5, I should say. The next step that communities can take, and this does begin to get into the area of controversy where your voters may have very strong opinions about it. You can build this network, but you can also light it, as they say, using the fiber optic idea. And you can establish what's called transport services, which is the most basic level of communications. There's a 7-layer model called OSI, and at the bottom is transport. It's basically how the bits get from here to there. And if you do that, you're creating a really great asset for the telecom industry. I mean, in the dark fiber network, they have to actually, do more work to get the service going. In this one, they literally plug in their gadgets at either end of the circuit, and they're up and running. And so you get private, so we, the community or the government, is operating a network in which we're providing the infrastructure, but also the transport, but we're not delivering any services. We don't bring on any customers. We don't bill any customers except for the carriers. But we've further reduced their costs and risks. And this has proven to be enormously effective in the right places in terms of increasing market competition. There is a caveat on this, however. That track record of success largely is true in urban and suburban markets. And I don't just mean in a suburban area that is next to a big city, but a suburban density kind of community, wherever it might be. When it's been tried in extremely rural areas, it hasn't worked that well. There's a couple of famous bad examples, one in Utah and one in Alberta province in Canada, where the network is very undersubscribed because they just can't, there's just not enough people to get on this massive network. So this hasn't really worked well there, but it has worked very well in other areas. Now, this is one of my favorite examples, actually. It's Parkland County, Alberta. It's a municipality, even though it's called a county, and it's the size of a county. It is on the border of Edmonton, which is the state capital. So the parts of the city that are closest to Edmonton are reasonably well developed, still very suburban or even exurban, but they've got several big industrial parks. There's economic activity there. The farther west you go, however, the hillier the terrain becomes, the more remote each community becomes, and pretty soon you're in areas that are just, summer cabins and lakes. They wanted to do something to equal that playing field. And so they came up with this idea. They were able to get some money from the province to capitalize a set of communication towers. This is for wireless communications, mobile. And to build the fiber backhaul, as it's called, to connect those towers into the ground's network. And then they were able to rent space on that to mobile carriers and wireless ISPs, whose only investment in this thing was to hang a radio on the tower. Everything else was done for them. And so in addition to doing just the raw physical side of this thing, building the things and going out and trying to get the customers, they also came up with a clever business model, which said, if you want to hang your radios on a tower in our very developed section, one of our industrial parks, the cost is this. If you want to hang a radio on one of the towers in our rural areas, the cost is a small fraction of that. And so by doing that, they were able to encourage the rollout of broadband service, wireless broadband service, into places where they could never possibly have gotten it otherwise. So it ended up being a very, very successful project for them, and they were able to break even on their operating expenses in only 4 years. And because they were grant funded to do most of the initial capital investment, they didn't have to give that back. So it turned out to be a very good mix of public and private investment in that. And finally, if you want to live dangerously, you go all the way to compete head to head with the incumbent carriers. It's difficult, it's costly, it can be done. And it's basically the last resort, right? You only do it if nothing else is going to move the dial for you. And you have to not only have a great determination in your own government, but you have to have the people behind you. One of the secret advantages that a lot of rural communities have, and I know that's true in the Arrowhead, is ownership of local utilities. That's a great legacy of the last round of huge public investment in bringing utilities into rural areas where there was a tough business case. And today they stand you in good stead, because when you're already connected to every premise in the place, running communications is, again, a cheaper proposition, a lower risk proposition, and a quicker one. And in addition, particularly if you're doing electric utilities, having that communications infrastructure in place can actually save a great deal of money on generation and produce a much more reliable quality of service for electricity. So it ends up being a pretty good deal. What really drives this model, though, is that it's a different mission. We're not really trying to necessarily make a big profit from this. What we're trying to do is contribute to economic growth and a better quality of life. We need to have some revenues. We need to be able to make enough money to continuously maintain and upgrade the network, but we don't have the same incentive as the private sector. And this is one of probably the most dramatic story I know of this. This is Bristol, Virginia Utilities. It's in Bristol, Virginia. It's in a very rural part of that state, down south on the Tennessee line. And across the Tennessee line, in fact, you can see it in this picture, on one side of the Tennessee line is Bristol, Virginia, and on the other side of it is Bristol, Tennessee. So they're cheek by jowl, very similar in some ways, and yet completely different in their willingness to take on a big challenge. Bristol has a city-owned utility, Bristol, Virginia Utilities, and it got the city council's approval to build a fiber control system throughout its substation network. And at that, again, economics worked out beautifully. And so the council said, well, that's interesting. How about building that out to a government network? And so they did that. And again, the economics worked out really well for them. Bristol's government suddenly had really good service that it had never had before. And then the word got out to local business. And local business said, how about us? And so after due deliberation, the council decided to say, yep, okay, we're going into the public internet service business. Well, that kicked off a firestorm that lasted for 3 years. You had the incumbent cable company, the incumbent telephone company, dragging them into court, dragging them into the legislature. And they spent a total of 3 years and $2.5 million in legal fees for a relatively small place before they finally got the right to deliver voice, video, and data within the city lines of Bristol, and internet and voice outside it. Nobody would really want to do this if they didn't have to, but it ended up for the city having a very happy ending. Within 5 years, they achieved a 62% market share. And their research says that they saved their customers about $10 million in subscription fees. Now, this is obviously why the incumbents were so intent on stopping them. But nonetheless, it worked out very well for them. In fact, Bristol has become a regional hub for its network, is now reaching into 2 other counties. And they're delivering a lot of services to people who don't live in Bristol at all. So it's been a very successful rollout for them. So there you have it. From land use policy, which is the least aggressive thing you can do, and yet, if that's what you're capable of doing because of politics or other reasons, then that's what you should be working on, all the way up to saying, I'm building the network and I'm just going to be another provider, and we'll make that work somehow. So what are the takeaways from this? And there's a lot of stories to pile on you, but I find those stories at least help get the point across. The biggest takeaway is that you have options, and I know that so many of you have been exploring those options, and so many of you have acted on aggressive plans to roll out. But you're going to need to keep doing that. And in nearly every situation, no matter where you think you're stuck, there's actually action you can take that's going to make a difference. If the results might not be immediate, but they will be there. One of the single most important things you can do is to learn to think like a telephone company or a cable company. They've been doing it a long time and they're pretty good at it. And doing that means that you're going to be able to help them find low risk revenues. Wherever you can do that, you're likely to have a really good reception from a private sector company. And I'm sure most of you can attest to this better than I can. You absolutely need to manage your political support. Voters are more concerned about risk even than the people who are leading city government or county government. And if they don't understand it, it's going to be really hard to get it across. One of my favorite efforts in this area is something that Fort Collins, Colorado did. They did a huge grassroots campaign to convince people that they would build their own network in this case. And they did most of it in bars because there's a big craft brewing move in Fort Collins. And so they called it Beer and Broadband. Beer and Broadband. And gosh, they got people to show up for that. And finally, and this is going to sound a little weird to a lot of you, consider building a data center. Sure, it's hard enough to think about getting yourself a network, but try to consider building a data center because it is a very interesting driver of success. The telephone company does it. Every place they go, they call it a central office. And the reason that they do it is it takes your network and adds a level of economic development potential that would never exist otherwise. So first of all, it's a great way to support the municipality or the county's own network and data needs, right? You can host your applications inside this data center and create basically a data hub for the region. And in many communities we've studied, they'll start out building software applications to run their own services and find neighboring communities saying, can you slap a different look on that and do it for us? And the answer is sure, we'll do that. And now, again, they're creating innovation in government that's very powerful for the entire region. It also provides a very high quality place for other networks to connect to you. And the thing about having a network is has very little value unless you're well interconnected with the rest of the world. The better the kind of co-location space, as it's called, you have, the more likely you are to attract one or two. And when you've got one or two, the value of that location just went up by a great deal, because this is where the carriers all trade traffic with each other, and they do it without charging each other. They just trade traffic because it saves them so much money and difficulty to do it this way. So it's a great place to do that. And it also is a platform for offering high value services to local business, to local institutions, to universities, community colleges, schools, to make them more competitive. Probably the most dramatic example of this that we've seen is actually in Taiwan, where there's a city that has got a very large base of small precision manufacturers, about 1,500 companies. And they went around and talked to their companies, what can we do to help you? And the answer was, well, we can't get a lot of work from big companies because we can't afford what's called an enterprise resource planning system. And that's a requirement for us to become a supplier to them, plug into their supply chain. So the city went out and leased an enterprise resource planning system, put it into their data center, and provided low-cost access to all of those companies. And it had a transformative effect on the kind of business that they were able to generate. And again, so that's a very extreme example, but almost any one of these, there's so many applications that companies would like to have. Most of them don't have the IT savvy to do it. They'd love to have access to it. And if you can help them out, you've done a real economic development service while also strengthening your network proposition. So that's my usual fire hose of information for you on how the heck what you can do in this area of connectivity. And we've now come to the fun part, which is where we get to talk about it. And let me
Thank you, Robert.
Sharing my screen. You are welcome.
So Northeast Minnesota is very lucky to have the Northeast Service Co-op, which is an open access network. It started as a school, library, government network, still is that, but now has, creates the best possible deals to lower the risks for providers. And we've seen, a handful of public or private sector providers on their network. And so that is a great example for this region, or a great asset for this region to build on. Dwayne, do you want to talk a little bit about how that's might work up in your township? Catch you off guard there.
Yeah, you did catch me off guard. Say again, what was that?
Well, just as you're trying to solve your broadband problem, how do you see Northeast Service Co-op as a part of that? They're
close, and it certainly is a location. The Northeast Service Cooperative does go to the east of us, and of course, they're just to the south of us. So it's definitely something that we will probably be taking a look at. We're of course, our Paul Bunyan deal got, because of that lack of border to border funding, they kind of pulled out. There's still a little hope that maybe they can work out, but hey, Northeast Service Cooperative, you're probably the next best deal.
Okay, was Paul Bunyan not going to use, were they going to build their own network to you guys?
Well, they've already got a connection point within the township right there at 169 and 53.
Okay,
So they're already in the township. So it would have been easy for them to build out, but they, the funding, because of RDOF and bidding on so much of our project area, Paul Bunyan, without that, they kind of, and they didn't get the border to border for that areas that weren't, that RDOF covered. So Paul Bunyan is looking at the financial end of it and going, we can't do it. We still got some hopes. We're still working on it, trying to revive it. So, it's to be determined.
okay,
But Northeast Service Cooperative is right there a few miles from us. So it definitely is something that's in the play.
okay, thanks. Pat, any comments from your point of view?
You don't want to hear my comments on that.
No, I know we're suffering from a lot of regional frustration right now.
I'm so mad at the RDOF thing and the LTD broadband that took over everything so that ours just got thrown in the trash can. Because they completely surrounded our whole little area that Paul Bunyan was going to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm just so frustrated with the whole idea of it. And LTD broadband has 6 years now to bring us fiber, where Paul Bunyan, we were talking next year of getting it in here.
Well, I understand, yeah. Other questions or comments for Robert?
I was just thinking my comment, which I've been saying, telling people is Worry Township is the perfect example of the local township taking control and, identifying a solution that meets their needs. And it's just been super frustrating watching the federal investment come in and kind of blow that all apart.
Why does excuse my ignorance, why does the entry of the federal investment preclude continued activity in the local market?
Because the state government chose not to fund state grants where there was overlap,
So this,
Okay.
which
Yeah,
sounds
the world-
good in theory, but
Yeah, but interesting. I mean, this is going to sound, I get a little worried whenever I hear a lot of grantitis stuff. It's like, yeah, if you wait for somebody to give you free money, it can be a long wait. What can you do within the resources that you have to try to change, to try to move some things along? And it takes a lot of creativity. And I know it's the opposite of easy. But boy, always waiting for somebody else to fund you. That's kind of a frustrating position to be in.
yep. And I think the township is looking at, how do we move this forward? It's locally supported project. So
Yeah.
good
And you
thing.
really, the takeaway really from the work we've seen is that there's just, there's things there's incremental things you can do. You can take a small thing and build on success. I mean, one of the most successful, open access networks in the world is in Stockholm. So big city, capital of Sweden, But I've interviewed them and I said, so you just get this big idea and build this big network across your city? He said, no, of course not. We started with this little teeny tiny fiber build in our business district because, we figured we could make that work. And they did it. And they have this interesting thing, by the way, because again, we're not doing this on poles, we're doing this underground. They said, we decided that the primary driver of this is we were going to open the streets once, put in the infrastructure, close the streets, and nobody gets to dig them up again. which I thought was a really interesting selling point. But anyway, they took that, they made that work economically. And then they, said, okay, so now that's working. What else can we do? What can we extend? How can we, so it's not, I know none of this is, it sounds so easy for me to say it, but if somebody's a mile away, if their connection point is a mile away, gosh, that's bridgeable. So I just would urge you to not take those frustration. I mean, if you're waiting for somebody in the federal government to build something, okay, you could be waiting for, well, more than 6 years, right? Because in 3.5 more years, we may have a different federal government.
I see Betsy's on here. Betsy, if you're able to talk a little bit about what you've done in downtown Virginia with the Northeast Service Co-op network, leveraging that. I don't want to put her on the spot here either, but.
Yeah, no, that's okay. They do have dark fiber, like that the city and Northeast Service Co-op are in partnership on. And so some of the things that we're spitballing now are, can VITA give a grant to the small business to get connected, so the business pays some and VITA gives a small grant. And then from there, we're lighting up all that and showing the need for all that fiber in the downtown, so that over time, we can, I guess, show the need for the capacity, of what we have now and move forward. So that's some of what we're talking about. And hopefully, we can leverage that further with other programming then, federal EDA grants, what have you, if some of that comes through. So, but yeah, we're not sitting around waiting. We called up CTC and they're out, working with Northeast Service Co-op and the city to try and move that from just a city and government owned entity to private use.
In one of the counties of New York State, they had a very forward-looking county executive, and he led an effort which basically he went around to all the municipalities, water districts, school districts, and so forth in the county, and asked them what they were paying for telecom. He put the number together. It was like $50 million a year, and said, that's interesting. So then he went to a cable company that was also a systems integrator and said, I got $50 million a year in spend. What can you do for me? And it was, again, so the company said, well, fine, we'll build a network for you. And he said, by the way, you're not going to make any money from us on this network. He said, I just want you to know that you're not going to turn a profit. You're going to break even. And then you're going to have to go out and sell service to all the businesses and everybody else who wants to get on the network. And he pulled it off. He pulled it off because he aggregated demand. And when you've got people spread out over a long distance, if you can do something to aggregate demand, it puts you in a completely different position. I got a lot of ideas. I haven't had to implement any of them. So, I bow to all of you who actually have to implement them.
Whitney, what would you say? I mean, you've funded a lot of projects now in Northeast through IRRR. What's the defining highlight of those that have made them successful?
It's the partnerships between, multiple levels of government, private sector, cooperatives. When I think of the three of my favorite, we have that Ely Fiber to the Business project that's going to start up this spring. They're going to be putting customers online. And that was a partnership between the Ely PUC, the CTC, and Northeast Service Co-op, and the agency came in with funding, right? So there's these four entities coming in together to meet a business need. I think it was like 100%, 99% of the businesses in downtown Ely wanted a better solution and would pay the fee. Like you talk about aggregating the demand there. That's kind of what they did. And then they figured out how to fund it, and they're building it for their downtown core. And I think that's a model that we could replicate across the Iron Range. We're hoping to with that federal EDA grant in Hibbing and Virginia, kind of like what Betsy was just talking about. And there's opportunity to do similar things like that in Eveleth and other communities across the Iron Range. And then we always forget about one of the first projects where we expanded the Northeast Service Co-op middle mile into these townships. So we paid for that middle mile infrastructure to go to 30 rural town halls across the Iron Range. And I know that didn't provide direct household connections at the time, but it extended the infrastructure that will now hopefully allow a CTC or another provider to come in and do those household connections. So those are the two that really looking back, I'm pretty proud of. But you can't go wrong with the Paul Bunyan expansion either. Those are great. And we've continually every year supported Paul Bunyan's expansions.
And they're a
Whitney, I have a
telephone
question.
cooperative.
How did Worry Town Hall miss out on that one? I mean, if you went to 30 different townships, because you
I
got
don't-
Pike,
Right, we went to Pike.
but you
I
missed
don't-
us.
I don't know. You know, that was right when I first started. So back 2015, 2016. So
Okay.
I'm not sure why.
I mean, you had to go right down our road.
Right. Right. Well, knowing what I know now, right?
Hindsight's
it's-
2020, right?
Maybe you have it in your building, you don't even know it.
Yeah, I don't have it. I got 10 up, 1 down here.
And I'm going to email John Lufin, just in case we've been making a poor assumption. But
Okay.
Yeah, for Worry Township, we know that this broadband is going to be a big thing for our future, and that it's and we just took steps in our last board meeting to put more funds into, and looking at the future, that we'll be able to put more funds into broadband expansion into the township. So we're being proactive on that, and hopefully it works out. Probably sooner than later.
well, it's so important, Dwayne. You're a township right on the edge of the core Iron Range. You're in the new Rock Ridge School District, which is going to be a amazing thing for the Central Iron Range, for the children and their future. And broadband's a key component. So I'm your
Yeah, and
biggest fan. So
we do have a school forest in our township too, which is used by all the students that go through the Virginia or Rock Ridge schools. So it's going to be an important hub.
Can we talk a little bit about where engagement and connectivity come together, Robert? In terms, how do you message? What are you seeing as the best practices on messaging to local residents around broadband?
Well, I think Whitney was kind of talking about it, right? I mean, you can only really move the dial a lot if you do have a lot of engagement in it. And the question is to find out, first of all, what their experience is. Do they have a problem? I mean, if people don't have a problem, then, that's fine. Almost certainly your business community has a problem, but I know that's got a bit of a push me, pull you, because small business in particular tends to be laggards in adopting digital technologies, right? So in some places where they don't have the entire nation of Australia, actually, where they don't have particularly good broadband, or certainly did not have it in the recent past, they put a lot of effort into generating understanding among the business community and building demand. So when you're talking about connectivity, engagement really means how do we build demand, right? So if this is an issue that lights people up, then it's really powerful to have, broadband and beer, or beer and broadband, I guess it is, to have some public engagement and find out what people feel about it. That example I told of Bristol, right? That only worked because people were just furious. They were just furious. They weren't going to take it anymore. It's another great example, actually, from Kentucky, where the local cable company refused to invest, and so they had a big public meeting, and the head of the local general manager came down and explained to all the people in the meeting that basically you folks are too stupid to run a data network, And so in that same meeting, the town passed a massive bill to invest in building their own network. So there's a great way to get, if you can get your enemy to help you with engagement, that's always good. But ultimately, it's the same as everything else, right? I mean, if people care about this, you have to first find out if they do, people, businesses, institutions. Then you have a basis for starting to find out, getting them to think about what could you do with broadband? What would you do with a better quality of broadband? Where are you hurting because of it? And if you have that public dialogue, you will find out pretty fast whether or not it's an issue that resonates with people now. And I suspect, of course, it does now because of our year spent in lockdown, or if it's something that you've got to do more education on. Bill, does that answer your question? I mean, it's kind of general, but it's the same strategies you do for anything else, whether it's sustainability or, it's you first find out where people are, you educate them a little bit in the process, you get them to tell you what you should do, and if you start to see energy coming out of that, then you work and build on it. And make it fun. Make it fun. That's why I guess that's why I like the beer and broadband so much, aside from the fact that it's beer. Just they made it fun.
That sounds good. Go ahead, Whitney.
I was going to say, Bill, is that you that says the 3 Bs, bikes, breweries, and broadband? Or who's
It is, but I've added blues bands now too.
Oh, 4 Bs. Okay. Or 5 Bs, blues bands.
Oh,
How about wine and Wi-Fi?
Wine and Wi-Fi is good too. I'm a wine drinker, so that makes more sense to me.
Well, and that, and with, we've got, you think about the different audiences in your community and, the idea that some people want to come to a wine and Wi-Fi and some people want to come to a beer and broadband. You need to have different approaches. And sometimes we kind of pull our hair out and say, why don't they want this? Why aren't they coming to a meeting? So on. And so I think we just have to find better ways to do it to attract various crowds. We just had a meeting in Pine County yesterday. We had over 50 people on a Zoom call, and Pine County's done very little on broadband over the last few years, but now all of a sudden they've got kind of the right message and they've got some of the right leaders and making a difference. Sometimes we say everyone needs a kippie, and a kippie is a person who's a township in St. Louis County that essentially went door to door throughout the 36 square miles and got people to sign up for the surveys, and he reported every month to the town board meeting about what the progress and they got ready and now have fiber to the home going to be built this spring or turned up now. So
We couldn't even get people to come to a free picnic. We were cooking bratwurst and had anything else you want to eat with it, and couldn't get people to come in.
Well, that's where trying to understand what the issues are can be powerful. Some examples I've seen is gotten down into what they call in marketing micro-targeting, right? So education is a powerful issue in a lot of places. So maybe, one way to target this is the parents of school-age children, since broadband has become essential to their education and will continue to be so going forward. There's an interest group that might get passionate about broadband if it's tied to education. And another group might be, again, if you can find the business communities that are communications dependent. And I check churches. I mean, church worship is online these days. So if you can target different groups within the community and find out whether they're passionate about it, they can become the core of something.
I would
As
just
opposed to just-
offer, so I mentioned, I think at the top that there've been in a lot of Zoom broadband conversations today. So one sort of learning that I can share from folks working in the space across the state is this idea: the most effective way to bridge that gap to the need is through the intermediary that holds the relationship with the person or family you're trying to reach. And that may not be a tech provider, but maybe it's the, so oftentimes a social service agency, or even, probation or the courts or the school counselor. But the relationship to the person is the most effective way to really figure out what's the gap. Is it affordability? Is it connectivity? Is it device? And then address the need. So.
Absolutely. Well, that's good. That's just good sales. You always figure out what the relationship is and use that. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that principle probably does hold, that if you are frustrated in the fact that you can't get people to show up to a general purpose, for everybody meeting, well, then maybe you step back and spend some time thinking and talking to people about what the most affected groups are, and try to work with them and either build that relationship or if you can find an intermediary. I mean, I don't know what the politics around school systems are, but I would think most educators, most school principals and superintendents of districts would be very interested in anything that made broadband more available to their community. And maybe they have the relationship.
Good. Any other questions or comments? Mark, any questions? Mark Jeffers? Austin is the new guy in Itasca County. We hear you need to have the whole county fibered by the end of next year. There'll be troubles. Any questions, comments? What do you see as your task?
Yeah, that's what I hear too. I think it's just a matter of, like we discussed in what Robert was talking about, the engagement of the communities, and how do we really, focus in and figure out what their needs are and relay that to the companies. And especially now more than ever, when we don't know how long we're going to be doing this online thing too. It's the uncertainty of it. And I think that's a big factor too, is just how do we engage everyone, and how do we fill the dots in between the providers, between us, between the government, between the private sectors. There's a whole mess of things.
Good. Austin's got the job of getting fiber to Bearville, so that's that kind of represents the challenge he's got going.
That might not be the hardest spot in Itasca County. Austin, talk.
Just throw the reel in the back of the truck and start rolling, man.
Bearville's right next to Morecambe Township, which got their grant, has Paul Bunyan doing next summer working there. So
that's this summer.
This summer, yes, yes.
It's
Next
just weeks
summer,
away, Whitney.
Worry.
Good. Well, I want to thank everyone. We're about out of time, and really interesting to see Robert's framework there of the different kind of levels of public engagement in the broadband development process. And I think we've seen all of those kind of projects in Minnesota, a good share of them in Northeast Minnesota. So we just need to figure out, what's the right approach in the right place and the right mix of funding. I think Robert's talk on, just waiting for the grant, I think is good advice. That's what resources do we have locally through the agency and so on to try and make projects happen with or without state or federal money. So, but it certainly has gotten more complicated on the state and federal projects now, kind of in between. We're waiting for this RDOF rulings, and that will have a big impact on rural Minnesota and the Arrowhead region.
I just want to call out what Whitney said. I mean, she's now recalling some successes. There is nothing like a couple of small successes to drive the next one. There's just nothing like it. And so if you can do something and win, you make a lot of friends.
Yeah, that's for sure. Thank you. And just in the chat, there's a registration for tomorrow's webinar, because the schedule's a little fun today. So this one's a day late. Tomorrow's right on schedule. So hope you can join us. It's on workforce. And I hope that there's a big crowd for that a lot of workforce activists in the Arrowhead region. So help us spread the word, please. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
All right. Well,
Thanks,
thank you all.
Robert.